But I'd like to take a few minutes to think about the interconnection of all of these. They don't just stand by themselves as far as St. Joseph is concerned. In 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French. Now an expedition could legally be taken through the territory. They wanted to know who lived there, the people and wildlife, natural features, especially the resources, and if there was a water route to the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts actually knew more about what they would find when they landed on the moon than Lewis and Clark knew about what they would encounter on their way west. Lewis and Clark began that journey of exploration on May 14, 1804. They passed by St. Joseph on July 7th and wrote in their journals about the large size of St. Michael's Prairie. Right now, we are sitting in part of St. Michael's Prairie. However, it was on their return visit that we want to focus today. On September 12, 1806, the Corps of Discovery actually stopped and camped at St. Michael's Prairie. Lewis and Clark chose to camp here because an old friend of Clark's was also camped here, Robert McClellan. He was leading a trading expedition to the Mandan villages, and Clark wrote that Mr. McClellan informed us that the people in general were concerned about us, and that they had heard that we were all killed, and then again they heard that the Spaniards had us in the mines. Now, if we were sitting here in this spot right now in 1806, we could have seen the smoke from their campfires as they had this conversation. Well, McClellan is the one who connects us to the next National Historic Trail, the Oregon Trail. 6 years later, in 1812, Robert McClellan was with a group of 7 from the Astorian fur traders. They were coming back from Astoria on the Pacific coast and followed a route very close to what would later be used by the wagon trains. These 7 men discovered South Pass across the Rockies in today's Wyoming, which made overland travel possible for the wagons and also for the Pony Express. Again, Robert McClellan, who was camped right within sight of here with Lewis and Clark on St. Michael's Prairie in 1806, was with that group. Now it is possible to easily move wagons across the Rocky Mountains. By 1830, fur trappers were crossing the mountains at South Pass. The first group of immigrants to use South Pass, outfitted in Weston, rendezvoused just west of Westport and began their journey in 1841. They were headed for Oregon, where there was land for new homes. In 1844, the first group of Oregon-bound immigrants, the Gilliam Party, outfitted in St. Joseph and crossed the Missouri River at today's Amazonia. That's just a few miles north of St. Joseph. And one of the members of that party was 34-year-old James Marshall. In 1846, Marshall left Oregon, and he headed south towards San Francisco, where he eventually formed a partnership with John Sutter to build a sawmill on the American River. Now we'll come back to Marshall, but now let's move to another one of the National Historic, one of the other trails not yet designated as a National Historic Trail, the Mormon Battalion Trail. In hope of gaining goodwill of the American government and funds to help with the move of the Latter-day Saints to the Salt Lake Valley, the Mormon Church agreed to supply just over 500 volunteers to serve in the Mexican War. Their military pay would be sent back to families. So the Mormon Battalion, the only religious-based unit in the U.S. military history, began their march from Council Bluffs to Fort Leavenworth. And there they would begin their service. This group marched through northwest Missouri. Those of you who are from this area, they marched through the towns of Mound City and Oregon, And on July 29th, 1846, they marched through the streets of St. Joseph. So that would just be a few blocks from here that they would have marched. To impress the Missourians who had run them out of the state in the 1830s, as we heard earlier, the group marched double file to look longer. This is what the St. Joseph Weekly Gazette reported. Upwards of 500 Mormons passed through this place on Wednesday on their way to Fort Leavenworth. Now, St. Joseph at this time had a population of about 800. They were well drilled, and from all appearances, they were led to believe, we are led to believe that they will make good soldiers and render efficient service in the expedition for which they are intended. A large number of them were without shoes, and in fact, the entire company was poorly clad. They take with their company 15 women and a large number of boys. The latter go as servants. We learn from a member of the company that upwards of 8,000 Mormons are still in camp now near Council Bluffs. Well, their route took them on south out of St. Joseph and generally along Highway 59. I think some of you may have taken that route yesterday, on to Fort Leavenworth. Now, one of those battalion members was Henry Bigler, and we'll come back to him. Mormon Battalion traveled on to Santa Fe and were instrumental in opening the wagon road across the Southwest. When their service ended, some of the battalion members went north and took jobs working at Marshall's sawmill. So here we are back to Henry Bigler, who marched through the streets of St. Joseph. He was working at Sutter's Mill, and it is from his diary that we find the actual date of the discovery of gold as January 24th, 1848. These Mormons were working their way back to join their families in the Salt Lake Valley. And they took the news of the gold discovery with them, and it would be carried on east, and this started the 1849 gold rush to California. This is Bigler's diary, and it's how historians can recognize the exact date of the gold discovery. His diary reads, this is January 24th, 1848. This day, some kind of metal was found in the tail race that looks like gold. And he spells that G-O-A-L-D. First discovered by James Marshall, the boss of the mill. So this brings us to the last trail, the California Trail. Because of the news of the gold discovery carried to the east, literally thousands of people were in Missouri river towns by the spring of 1849. They were waiting for grass to grow enough to support their livestock pulling their wagons. St. Joseph hosted most of these gold rush immigrants in 1849, 50, and 51. Although, as we noted earlier, immigrants had been leaving from St. Joseph in 1844, headed for Oregon. As we can see, St. Joseph does have several connections to the National Historic Trail, and that they are connected one to the other. And I just can't think of any other location that has so many connections to so many historic trails of significance to the development of our country. So now let's talk a little bit more in depth about the immigration from St. Joe and the St. Joe Road. And I think you've seen a couple versions of this particular picture during your visit here today. This is 1850 St. Joe. And it's a view of how the town appeared to those who came here to jump off. Most people left between the 1st of April and the middle of May, so they could cross the Sierra before fall snow falls. And I will try to use the immigrants' words as recorded in their diaries to tell you what their thoughts were. On May 2nd, 1849, John Banks wrote, We arrived at St. Joseph, a dirty town on the frontier of Missouri. Its growth has been very rapid, but its appearance is uninviting. Here we begin to see what excitement California has created. On the river then, in Lexington, confusion was enough, but here it is a complete jam. And in 1838, 1850, Eleazar Ingalls wrote, St. Joseph is quite a village and is doing a great business at this time, but the way they fleece the California immigrants is worth noting. The markets are filled up with broken down horses jockeyed up for the occasion and unbroken mules, which they assure you are as handy as sheep. It is the greatest place for gambling and all over rascality I was ever in. Well, the businesses in St. Joseph flourished as they provided supplies that the immigrants would need for their journey. And if you drive through our downtown St. Joseph, you can see some of the large, a remnant of some of the large warehouse buildings, which resulted from the movement of people west and the need for supplies, even after the initial need for supplies. On May 7, 1849, J. Goldsboro Bruff was an immigrant who camped in St. Joseph. He found it was too busy here and finally went to Council Bluffs to cross the Missouri River. This is Bruff's sketch of his camp in St. Joseph, and this is what he wrote in his diary while he was camped here. As far as we could see, over a great extent of valleys and hills, the country was speckled with the white tents and wagon covers of the immigrants. There were but two very indifferent scows at this ferry, and they are being plied from earliest day until midnight every day. From the principal street in St. Joe, down 300 yards, crossing a bridge to the riverbank, and I think they're talking about crossing Black Snake Creek, was one dense mass of wagons. As soon as the wagon entered the scow, the next moved down to the water's edge, and the mass in the rear closed to the front, affording the opportunity to one or more lucky wagons to fall into the extreme rear. Fighting for precedence was quite common. Now, you earlier had seen pictures by Rudolf Friedrich Kurz, a Swiss artist. This is another one that was sketched of the Iowa Indians in St. Joseph. And you have heard that in the 1840s, the Native Americans lived right across the river from St. Joseph. That was Indian territory. And that you have also heard that they were a very common sight in the streets of St. Joseph as they came to trade here. And this is a family that Kurz sketched in 1848. This is another sketch of Kurz of a group of Potawatomi Indians. They used to ferry back and forth across the Missouri River here, and this would have been the first time that many immigrants had seen Indians. Lodiza Frizzell wrote in 1852, they were in a hurry to cross over and crowded down to the water's edge. Many immigrants reached St. Joseph by riverboat. Some came overland, some came by riverboat. This is an 1860 view of St. Joseph taken from the Kansas side, so you're looking back at the town of St. Joseph on the hillside in 1860, so it had grown quite a bit from 1843 to 1860. This picture appeared in Leslie's Weekly. And you get maybe an idea of what the first glimpse of St. Joseph might have been to those immigrants who arrived by steamboat. April 27th, 1852, John Clark came aboard the steamboat Midas. On nearing the city, it shows a glowing front with high bluffs or barren banks to the rear. These, with the rich valley below, are dotted with wagons, tents, horses, and mules, and other stock to the number of 20,000, with a great portion of other equipage. I visited the heights to the rear of the city, where I had a full view of the great encampment. The numerous wagons, tents, and so many thousand head of stock on the ground is a sight that is seldom seen by one so old or during a lifetime. Crossing the Missouri River was an experience to remember, not only because of the number of people waiting their turn, but the river itself was wide. It had dangerous and shifting currents. It contained hidden snags, and also the immigrants were leaving the United States and entering Indian Territory. Although most crossings were routine, danger was always present. On May 6, 1849, John Benson crossed in a flat-bottom ferry and wrote, "As I was crossing with my wagon, it was with the utmost effort that a collision with a steamboat was averted. It missed us by only a few feet, and the waves nearly capsized our little craft. For an instant, I thought we were gone, but the boat righted itself, and for the shock, which was a real one, no danger was done." So we know that the Missouri River has changed constantly over the years. In the immigrants' day, it was wider and shallower, and its current was slower, and there were a lot of snags in the Missouri River at that time too. And these are two pictures that I think are really pretty, fairly recent paintings within the last 20 years or so of steam ferries carrying boats or carrying wagons across the river. This photo, taken in St. Joseph in 1859 by artist Albert Bierstadt, the one we usually think of as the beautiful landscape artist paintings, shows a wagon heading to the ferry. And this is one of the earliest actual photos taken in St. Joseph. Now, if you visit the riverfront today, you'll see that the St. Joseph citizens have placed a monument there at the location where the ferry crossing was, recognizing St. Joseph's role. However, you will also see that it is in need of repair in that area, and that's one of the things that the city is hoping to do, come up with a better riverfront plan and a way to move the traffic on Highway 229. Well, this is an early, well, let me ask you this. How many of you went on the St. Joe Road? Okay, and how of you have been on it before yesterday's tour? Okay, close. Okay, so there's quite a few. So you know that there's lower crossings and upper crossings, both leaving from St. Joseph. So this is an early photo of Belmont Landing, and this is at the base of the bluff, about a mile north of present-day Wathena. In addition to the ferry at St. Joseph, there were ferries about 4 miles upriver. The immigrants would have to travel through the bottomlands for this upper crossing. They'd have to travel through the bottomlands because the river at that time was on the other side of the floodplain. And then they would cross the river and immediately climb the bluffs. And that's what this is a picture of. In diaries where immigrants mentioned camping at the river bottom on the Missouri side and crossing and immediately climbing the bluffs, this is it, and this might be the monument that you saw on your field trip. Recently, the Donovan County Historical Society placed this monument at the site of the Belmont Landing. It's been known by various names, so if you're researching diaries, you might come across another name for it. At different points in time, the upper ferry had different names. If you travel the St. Joseph Road in eastern Kansas, you'll really have a pretty easy time because of the work that the Donovan County Historical Society and the Oregon-California Trails Association has done in placing directional signs and markers out along that trail, especially Donovan County, and hopefully on farther west eventually. Immigrant Hunt chose this upper crossing in 1849 and climbed the road up the bluff. On May 7th, he wrote, "In starting up the bluffs after leaving the river bottoms, the California and Oregon Trail winds around very much, so that several miles of it are closely in view at once. The whole length of this, as far as the eye could range, was covered with moving wagons, with ox and mule trains of every variety, while almost every ravine and grove by the roadside within a mile contained a camp of 1 to a dozen wagons, with tents pitched, and in many instances the United States flag waving over them in the bright sun and pleasant breeze of a lovely spring morning." So this view from the top of the bluffs looks to the east, and it's similar to what Hunt had. He was now in Indian territory and getting his last glimpse of the United States. Okay, immigrants who used the main St. Joseph ferry crossed the river and then traveled through 5 miles of river bottom. Now that's like you did on your field trip yesterday. You crossed the river, you went through the river bottoms over to Wathena, Kansas. And at the time of the immigrants, this was, when you saw it, it was pretty clear. But at the time of the immigrants, it was very heavily wooded bottomland. D.B. Andrews wrote on May 9th, 1849, upon reaching Peters Creek, which would be over at Wathena area, "1 mile after reaching the prairie on the creek, up which we came, is good camping. The road after leaving the creek rises a long hill, and at its top of the prairie is in full view." Now this is the road that Andrews traveled. It's still in use today in Wathena, and it's just west of the high school. You can see in the lower right the track of the school. Immigrants often mention meeting Indians carrying a note from the Indian agent requesting that some type of payment be given to them for crossing the Indians' land. James Madison Hutchings described such an encounter on June 9th, 1849. "We soon met 7 or 8 rather tall, well-built men, one of whom, the tallest and the finest-looking Indian I had seen, was the spokesman. He understood enough English to ask for 50 cents toll, and since we were passing through their territory and we thought that just, we gave them the sum asked." The trail from the lower crossing in the city of St. Joseph and the upper crossing would meet at the top of that hill, at the top of the bluff. And soon after crossing the river, many wagons decided that they needed to set up rules so they could have a more orderly move across the country. An example is given by James Tate in 1849. "We organized this evening having 15 wagons, 58 men and 2 ladies, adopting a Republican form of government." The immigrants also had to become accustomed to the routine and trails of camp life on the trail. Artist William Henry Jackson drew these sketches. He was very familiar with trail travel, having crossed the plains several times himself, and he made these sketches. Now, those of you who saw this yesterday saw a little different view. This picture was taken several years ago, and it's actually a better view than what you saw yesterday. But on the eastern part of the trail, it's unusual to see remnants of the trail. However, there are some that farming and road construction missed. This is a beautiful swale, I think, or depression left by thousands of wagons that passed. It's coming down the hillside into the Wolf River Valley. just north of Fanning, Kansas. The Gateway chapter placed markers down this swale. I think now there may be one marker, and there's a lot of brush that has grown up in it. But you can also go around that section there to the other side, and the other side looks pretty much like this. You've heard Wolf River mentioned a couple of times today, and that it was a difficult crossing because of the steep banks. The Indians helped the immigrants and themselves by having a bridge available to cross. The bridge was, one description I wrote was the bridge was made of logs stacked in the bottom of the river. There seemed to be a variety of charges for crossing the Indian toll bridge. On May 7, 1852, Lydia Allen Rudd reported paying 6 bits or 75 cents. In the same year, John Clark wrote, "Here was not the devil to pay, but instead a large Indian sat at the receipt of customs, demanding $1 per wagon for the privilege of crossing over to California should be full of gold if the immigrant expects to get back all his outlay in getting there. $5 per wagon and he had just started his trip. $5 per wagon and 50 cents for horses, mules, and oxen for crossing the Missouri River at St. Joe. And here again, $1 per wagon for passing over a bridge 50 feet in length, costing perhaps $150. This stream is called Wolf River, and crossing in any way except by the bridge would be a hard job. The Indian was making a good thing. Not less than 1,500 wagons passed over today. Well, Clark had crossed on May 9th, and it would seem that he was overcharged, since 4 days earlier, the charge was 50 cents. And still earlier, on April 29th, it was 25 cents. Lodiza Frozel wrote in 1852 about the Indian at the bridge. There were several of them there, quite fine-looking fellows, not near so dark as those I had seen, but of the real copper color, said they were of the Sac and Fox tribes. One was a chief. He was dressed in real Indian style and had his hair shaved off all except the crown lock, which was tied up and ornamented with beads and feathers. And this particular painting is by Carl Bodmer of a Fox Indian of the tribe that she said she saw. The Iowas, Sac and Fox, Potawatomi, and Kickapoo were all encountered in today's eastern Kansas. And this is the mission as you saw it yesterday. Just a few miles past Wolf River, they came to the Iowa Sac and Fox Presbyterian Mission. And the great Nemaha Sub-Agency was located at that time just about a mile southwest of the mission. Almost all diarists passing this area mention one or both of these. The mission and the agency were established in 1837 when the Indians were moved across the river from northwest Missouri as part of the Platte Purchase Treaty. And as you heard this morning, it is still there today and is operated by the Iowa tribe. And I hope a number of you get a chance to visit it tomorrow. On May 13th, 1849, John Banks reached the mission and recorded in his journal, "We started for Missionary Station. I heard a sermon from a good speaker and was much pleased to hear the Indian children sing. It was a scene I shall always remember with great pleasure." It is important to remember that the look of the land in Kansas has changed since the immigrants passed through. Upon leaving the bluffs in the immigrants' times, there weren't many trees. There were only trees along the creeks and the rivers and in the draws. There was rolling hills, no trees. Also, the creeks were smaller since the prairie grass would soak up the rain like a sponge and decrease the amount of runoff. As soon as settlers began to move in and break the sod, then erosion would become a problem. Sterling Clark in 1849 May described this prairie, just about in this area after crossing Wolf River. Truly, we are now where the flowers spring up unsown and die ungathered, and waste their sweetness in the desert air. So they're calling it a desert at that time. Rattlesnakes very plentiful. And then can you imagine this scene in this area as described by U.S. Major Osborne Cross in his journal of May 23, 1849. All these trails followed ridges, which placed the wagons frequently in such positions that they seemed to be crossing the prairie in every direction. And as their white covers were well trimmed, they looked at a distance not like vessels on the wide ocean steering for different parts of the globe. Well, some of you on your field trips yesterday almost saw some of this. Storms on the open prairie were sometimes violent and spectacular. There were reports of people being killed when struck by lightning. However, most likely, danger from lightning was what might be caused from livestock, would cause livestock to stampede. Father Timothy Limfret wrote in May 1848, "The night of the 20th and the 21st was both frightening and catastrophic. A terrible storm broke around 8 o'clock that evening. The rain came down in buckets, and the wind blew with extreme violence. Our tent was just about carried away by the hurricane several times. Since they had failed to put out the fire, large burning embers were being picked up by the wind and tossed as far as our wagons. We narrowly escaped being burnt alive. An hour later, water was streaming into our tent, and as I crouched down in order to hold down the tent's sides, I could soon feel my knees soaking in the water that was pouring over our bedding." I can just picture this happening. "So I let go my hold to go to find shelter in the wagon, and I spent the rest of the night there, chilled to the morrow." Now there's lots of areas in between the prairie, kind of in the Hiawatha area where you all, I think, stopped yesterday, and the Big Blue River. There's the Nemaha crossing, but due to time, we're going to skip part of that. But I will say, the Wolf River, there were 3 major river crossings in Kansas. The first one was the Wolf, the second one was the Nemaha, and the third one was the Big Blue. And at the Nemaha, they had a fairly easy crossing. They had to dig out the sides to take the wagons down, but there seemed to be a stone ledge across the bottom of the Nemaha River. But the Big Blue was the third major river crossing, and we have some people here who live right close to the Big Blue River. The immigrants usually found the Big Blue fordable with a depth of about 3 feet. The water came close to their wagon boxes if they forded. The water was described as clear and drinkable. However, if it had been a rainy spring, the Big Blue was impossible to ford, and wagons had to be ferried. Wagons could be delayed for weeks at the Big Blue. In May of 1850, there was a city of tents on the riverbank with about 2,000 people camped there. James Bennett reached the Big Blue at 10 a.m. on May 28, 1850. This stream, fordable at ordinary times, we now found very much swollen. About 50 wagons were already collected on the bank, and several companies were occupied in crossing in rudely constructed rafts. A number of Pawnee visited the different encampments and appeared quite friendly. Now just about, I think about 20 miles past the Big Blue, you come to this area. It's where the Independence Road and the St. Joe Road joined. Just about 20 miles west of Marysville, Kansas. Straight out Highway 36, Marysville, is about 100 miles or 2 hours from St. Joseph. For the immigrants in the mid-1800s, it was a 2-week journey. James Pritchard reached this area in May 1849 and described the huge number of wagons converging. By noon today, we came to where the St. Joseph Road and the Independence Road came together. It was alarming to see the long strings of wagon that were on the road. I counted just passing before us as we came into the St. Joe Road, 90 ox teams in one string. As far as the eye could reach, forward and back, the road was just lined with them. It would appear from the sight before us that the nation was disgorging itself and sending off its whole inhabitants. Well, this is a group of early trail historians, 1841. Some of the members of the old Oregon Trail Memorial Association are there. You can see Harry Driggs is in that picture. And the little lady standing there to the left of the monument is known as Mrs. Travaloot. And I think she is particularly interesting. She's a Maryville resident who actually saw a Pony Express rider come through their town. The marker still stands today at the intersection of 2 gravel county section roads, and the landowner reminded us of that he said that he's reminded of the trail as he drives his tractor across his field because he can tell that the ground is not level and that he thinks he can still feel some of the wagon train swales. And then this is a picture in 2019 when a group of Gateway members visited this site and are standing in the exact location where they stood in 1941 when the monument was dedicated. So geographically, this is where both the Independence Road and the St. Joe Road end, and the two merge to become the Oregon-California Trail. Traveling from St. Joe to this point would have taken 10 to 13 days, and the immigrants would have about 4 months more travel before reaching California. Well, during the mid-1800s, immigrants were not, or elephants were not at all common in the Western Hemisphere, so the phrase, "to see the elephant," meant to gain worldly experience or to see something exotic, and it became the motto of the immigration. To the immigrant, seeing the elephant referred to the perils of the trip, the thrill of the adventure, or facing hardships. Whatever its usage, seeing the elephant was a personal challenge owing much to the individual immigrants' experiences and their state of mind. By the time the immigrants reached the end of the St. Joe Road, they were not yet 200 miles from St. Joseph, but some had already had several glimpses of the elephant. Camped at the Big Blue River on April 27th, 1850, Walter Griffith Pigman mentioned the elephant. 3 men passed us today taking the back track. They must have seen the elephant soon. And John Clark even started out his journey from St. Joe thinking about the elephant when he wrote on May 8, 1852, "All hands up early, anxious to see the path that leads to the elephant. We hurry the morning grub, saddle the mules, and gather in the steer, and we are soon in line, winding our way up the first summit of the Great Plain." So he climbed the bluff, and he's up at the top. On our arrival, I held up for a moment, taking a general view of the wonderful and barren-looking desert to the west. Great God, I thought, what a sight lay before us. And he was going to have lots more sights as he continued his journey. Now, the only trail that I did not mention on that list is the Pony Express National Historic Trail. And as a result of the immigration to the West, over 500,000 people went to Oregon and California by 1860. which led to the need for faster mail communication. And so the Pony Express National Historic Trail resulted from that, and here we are at that location today. So I hope you take an opportunity to visit the museum, learn more about the Pony Express National Historic Trail. Cindy has a tour at 4:45 that she is doing, and I think that brings me to the end of my program, so I enjoyed visiting with you today.